Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting the buildings from Time of Legends, Joan of Arc by Mythic Games. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the first episode in a brand new painting series. And today we are starting to paint Time of Legends, Joan of Arc by Mythic Games. And we are kicking this series off by painting the buildings that come in the core or base game, as well as the Teutonic Knights expansion. So I chose to kick off this series by painting the buildings because I have never had an opportunity to paint a building before, because board games with minis usually just come with characters. They don't normally come with terrain and buildings and things like that. And so when we opened up the box to have a look at what the overall components look like and we saw all of these buildings, I knew straight away that this is what I was going to be painting first, because I've always wanted to paint buildings because I've watched plenty of videos on YouTube of people painting terrain and buildings and things like that and always thought it looked like heaps of fun. So I've always wanted to give it a go, but just never had the opportunity. And so seeing as these were in the box and they look so awesome, the detail and texturing is so cool, I knew I had to start it off by painting these. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I painted 5 different types of buildings that came between the base set and the Teutonic Knights expansion. But there is quite a bit of overlap in terms of the types of texture and detail and the sorts of techniques that I use. So to really clearly show you how I do those different textures and build up those different types of materials, I'm going to show you in detail how I did them with the church here, because this is the biggest one with the most amount of detail. And then later on, I will still show you how I painted the 4 other types of buildings, but I'll just speed that up and I won't talk through those because for the most part you'll just be hearing me say the same sorts of things, but it'll still be good to show how I took the techniques that I used in this one and then applied them to all of those. There are a couple of little differences with some of the other ones, so I'll jump back in to talk about what I'm doing specifically with them, but for the most part it'll be the same. So I'll talk in detail with the church here and then I'll leave you to watch how I paint the other ones as well. So to start it off, I hit all of the minis with a black prime. Now the reason that I went with black is because I want there to be an overall aged and weathered look to each of these buildings. And so as I base coat over the top of the black, I'm not really going for full opacity. I'm happy for there to be some inconsistencies in how much opacity there is from one spot to another. And in those spots where some of the prime is allowed to show through a little bit, that black will come through and that'll just help to add to the overall weathered look, because there will be some natural inconsistencies in the opacity of the paint. And so then the first thing that I did here with the church was to paint the bricks that are showing through from where this stuccoed kind of rendered effect has broken off. So I just base coated that with earth brown, which is one of my mid-tone browns. And the reason that I went with a mid-tone brown is because I knew that I was going to be finishing it with a brown wash over the top. And by starting with a brown that's not too dark, it'll mean that by the time it darkens down, because of that wash, there'll still be a little bit of lightness to it. The finish of it won't be too dark. And then I just wet blended in some red and orange over the top, just to give it that more natural brick kind of tone, as well as giving it a little bit of variation. And then just that brown wash over the top, just to dull it all down a little bit and to flow into the recesses of all of the joins, which just helped finish it off by bringing out all of the texture. Now, one thing that I reflected on as I got a little bit further into the painting was that there wasn't actually as much variation in the brickwork as what I hoped there would be. So when I paint some of the later buildings and I do more brickwork there, you'll see that I individually pick out some of the bricks with the red and the orange, just a random kind of smattering of each, so that then when that brown wash goes over the top, you still get that textured effect as it flows into all of the joins, but it does bring out a little bit more natural variation and it makes it look a little bit more realistic, I suppose, because there is a bit more variation in the colour. But now I'm working on this rendered stucco part of the wall, and so to start that off, I just base coated with bone white, which is the color that you can see that I'm using here, and then I just put a sepia wash over the top just to dirty it up a little bit and start to make it look a little bit weathered and dirty and grimy. And then I went to my Agrax Earthshade, which is my dark brown wash, and then I just used that right around the edge of each of the sections that are divided by the wood, and that's just to further give the effect that there's some weathering, and that weathering and built up dirt and that sort of effect is more focused around the edge of each of these panels. And then just to finish it off, I went back to the bone white color, which is what I base coated it initially with, and just using a cross between dry brushing and stippling, I just stippled this into the middle area of each section just to make sure that I left some of that darker wash color around the outside still showing. And then what this has done is added to that overall weathered effect because it brings back that initial color of what the render would have been, but then it sort of inconsistently shows through some of those wash colors from underneath, which just adds to that aged and weathered look that I was going for. But also by doing that actual stippling technique rather than just a normal dry brush, it adds a little bit of texture there as well. And really with these buildings, that's the big thing that I was going for, is bringing out the textures and then just the natural variation in the colors as opposed to any sorts of lighting effects or anything like that. And now I'm getting into painting all of the different wood areas across the entire church, and like all of the other materials across the building, the main thing that I'm going for here is an aged and weathered look. So I base coated with muddy brown, which is one of my darkest browns, and that's so that after I've done all of the dry brushing here with gradually lighter and lighter browns by mixing in grey, I can get lots and lots of contrast between the areas that haven't weathered and the areas that have, because the final stage to finish off this wood effect will be to put some different toned washes over the top. And so I need to be able to get a lot of contrast going on here so that these different tones are able to show through with that wash. So to start to build up these weathered areas of the timber, I just took that muddy brown colour that I base coated with, and I've started to mix in a little bit of misty grey, which is my lightest grey. And then I'm just dry brushing over the top of all of the different wood sections so that it'll catch all of the raised areas, but the recesses in between all of the boards and the grains will be left nice and dark. And then layer by layer, I'm just gradually mixing in more of the misty grey, but as I mix in more of the misty grey and it gets lighter, I'm reducing the amount of area that I'm covering with the dry brush. So if we look here as I'm painting the door, you can see that I'm concentrating those lighter layers on the middle of the door because that's the part that I want to look the most weathered. So as each layer gets lighter and lighter, I'm painting a smaller and smaller radius, I suppose. If you imagine that I'm painting gradually smaller and smaller circles, and those circles are converging just on the middle of the door, so that that's the part that will look the most weathered. And then I'm applying that same basic principle to all of the other beams that you can see here. So I'm not evenly highlighting or dry brushing every single bit of wood. I initially did that for the first layer or two, but then as it gets lighter and lighter, I'm picking maybe like an end of a beam and concentrating the dry brushing there, so that as the washes then go over the top, it'll bring out that weathered look because it'll start to bring the brown tones back, but by allowing all of these different layers of this undercoating to come through, it'll make it look like it's weathered inconsistently. There are some parts of the wood that have aged more than other parts. And so here are the different coloured washes that I'm going to be using. So I've got a red, a sepia, and then the dark brown. So the sepia is the one that I'll be using the most, which is the one that's going down here on the door first. And you can already see the effect that it's having, because all of that dry brushing is allowed to show through. And so the parts where I used more and more grey appear more and more weathered than the other parts, because there's a less intense brown to them. Now you can also see that I use the Agrax Earthshade, which is the dark brown, right around the edge. That's just to really boost that contrast, to make the aged parts look really, really aged. And then, just because I wanted a little bit more variation in the colour of the wood, I used some red right in the middle, just to make it look a particular type of wood. I wasn't going for certain species of wood or anything like that. I just wanted the wood for the door just to have that slight reddish tinge to it, but I didn't really use any red for the other beams. And that just helps to make it look as though maybe it's a special type of timber that has been used for the door, or at the very least they just weren't able to use the same type of timber for all of the wood. It just adds to that natural variation. But for all of the timber across the entire building, it was just done in the exact same way. So just starting with that muddy brown, nice dark brown to start with, and then just mixing in grey and just dry brushing over the top of that. And the areas that I wanted to look more weathered than others got more of the misty grey mixed into it, and then just those different browns over the top with the washes, just to tint it back to brown, but it allows all of that dry brushing to show through to give that weathered kind of effect. And now we're getting onto all of the stonework. So I just used stone grey, which is one of my grey colours, and I just base coated all of the stones. You can see that I left a little bit of a gap in between each of the stones, just to really help emphasise the fact that there are separate stones. And now I'm just throwing some simple brown, green and black washes over the top, just to add a really, really basic weathered effect to it. So I laid the Agrax Earthshade, the dark brown wash down first, and then I've just used some black and green in different spots just to add to that weathering. I found that when I put the green down, that it was a little bit too much, so after putting the green down and then blending it into the brown wash around it, I then went back with some more brown over the top, just to knock the green down a little bit, so that it's still there and it can still be seen, but it's just not too over the top. Now, like I mentioned with the brickwork, one thing that I found with doing the stones like this is that there wasn't as much variation in them as what I hoped that there would be. And so in some of the later buildings where I do stonework again, you'll see that I put some different colours into the base coating of some of the different stones, just so that you do get a little bit more natural variation, because not every stone is going to be the same colour. Alright, so now I'm starting to work on each of the windows, and the basic effect that I wanted to build up here is as though there is a glow or some sort of a light source coming from inside the building, just to make it look as though it's occupied, and that this would be coming from a fireplace or candles or something like that, just a general glow coming from the inside. So I started with one of my mid-tone reds and just painted that kind of across horizontally in the middle section, and then I just wet blended in some black from above, and that's just to make it look as though the light source is coming from below the height of the windows and is then gradually disappearing as it gets higher into the ceiling, and then just from below wet blended in some orange and some yellow. Now, you might have noticed that this is the second layer of the wet blending that I've done. That's because I did an initial layer and thought that that would be enough, but because it was going over the black prime, as it dried, it became really, really dull and very, very faint. It wasn't really easy to see. So I really did need to do that second layer, because that was able to really build the opacity that I got in the end, because all of those blends were going over those same colors that were already there from the first coat. And so when I do this same effect on windows in later buildings, I just do an initial first layer of just the red, and then after that's dried, the second layer is to then do all of that blending, so it gives it a better base coat to work over as opposed to the black prime. And now here I'm just picking out the window frames and the bells, being a church, there are going to be some embellishments and some more ornate features, so I went with a bronzy colour for that, just to contrast nicely against the stone and brickwork of everything else. But at the moment, all of that bronze colour is far too bright and reflective for the overall weathering that I'm going for the entire building, and so I finish all of these metal sections off with a black wash, just to knock all of that shine off and dull it down a little bit, just so that it ties in a little bit better to all of the other materials and the overall weathering. And now we're getting into the last part of the church, which is the slate roof. Now, there is lots of different ways that you can go about this, different colours that you could use. If you wanted to go with more of a stone sort of a look, you could use different types of greys, but I wanted to lean more into the different brown tones, just because I thought that would tie in really, really well with the other colours that I've used across the rest of the building. So I base coated with Beastie Brown, I think it was called, which is just one of my mid-tone browns, but it almost has like a little bit of orange in it, which I thought would work really, really well for these roof tiles. And now I'm just throwing a dark brown wash over the top, which is just going to flow nicely into all of those recesses and just really, really darken it down. And so now I've gone back to Beastie Brown, which is the base coat colour, but I have mixed in a little bit of Misty Grey, which is that same really, really light grey that went into the dry brushing colour for all of the wood. And so now I'm just lightly running across the tops of all of the different roof tiles, just to help bring that texture out a little bit more. And so now with the next layer of the dry brushing, I've mixed in more of the Misty Grey, but you can see I've reduced the amount of area that I'm dry brushing, because again, I'm going for an overall weathered look, but I don't want it to all look as though it's weathered to the same degree. And so for every layer of dry brushing that I do, it gradually covers less and less and less area, but every layer gets lighter and lighter as more of that misty grey gets mixed in, until eventually I'm just dry brushing with straight misty grey, which I'm about to do here, and you will see this will be the smallest amount of dry brushing that I will do. And the same principle is being applied here as to how I painted all of the wood, because to finish it off, I'm going to put some different coloured washes over the top. It'll be that same sepia wash and dark brown that I've used before, and that's going to flow back into all of the recesses to bring that texture back out, but it's also going to allow the different tones that I built up through this dry brushing to show through, which will tie everything back in together so that all of the roof tiles will be brown, but to differing degrees, so that it'll look as though some parts have faded and aged a little bit more than other parts. And so there we go, that is the church finished. I was so happy with how this came up. This is my very first building that I have ever painted, and I wasn't totally sure about how I was going to do all of the parts before I started. I had a pretty good idea of certain bits, but I just really enjoyed painting this because I found it to be a very freeing way of painting, I suppose, because I'm used to painting characters from board games, and those, compared to these buildings, are much smaller with much tinier details. And what that means is that you need to be very precise with your brushwork and where you're putting certain colors and getting really smooth blends from one color to another, so that you can accurately reflect the way that paint is hitting the different surfaces, those sorts of things. So you just need to be very precise. Whereas I didn't find that so much with these buildings, because they are much bigger, the details are much larger, and you're focusing more on building those textures and getting lots of tonal variety, so there just wasn't that need to be quite as precise as with smaller miniatures. Now, that doesn't mean for a second that these are easier to paint than a smaller character, not at all. I just found that when painting buildings, you just don't need to focus as much on getting all of those tiny details correct. What you're focusing on more, like I said, is building up the textures and tonal variations over larger areas, which means you can be much looser with your brushwork and style of painting, and I just found that to be really enjoyable. And now I don't want to call it too early, but there is a lot of potential here for buildings and terrain to be my favourite thing to paint over characters. I will need to paint a few more though, but that'll just be an interesting thing to see if that develops as I paint more. And while I've painted all of the buildings that we have in our various boxes of Joan of Arc, I do still have some smaller bits of terrain that I'll keep working on, which I'm really looking forward to painting and seeing over time if I do prefer to paint buildings and terrain over characters. But now that I've finished painting the church and I'm now onto these other smaller buildings, I am going to leave you now to watch the rest of the video because most of the colours and techniques that I use for the rest of them are exactly the same as what I did in the church. But there were a couple of little things here and there where on reflection I thought of better ways that I could do some of the things that I did with the church. So when I get to them on the other buildings, I'll come back in and further explain what I'm doing there. But for the most part, I'll leave you just to hopefully enjoy the rest of the video, because like I said, I did really enjoy painting these. Alright, so I'm already back pretty quick, and that's because the way that I did the stonework on this building here, and for all of the stonework in the buildings for the rest of the video, is different to how I did it on the church. Like I talked about earlier, my issue that I had with the way that I painted the stonework on the church was that there just wasn't enough natural variation in the way that one stone looked compared to another. They looked as though they were all the exact same colour, whereas in reality, that's just not going to happen. So you can see with this one, I haven't even base coated with a grey, I base coated with my aged bone, which is more of a tanny kind of colour. And then to pick out a few different stones to get some variety from one stone to the next, I grabbed bone white, which is the off-white colour that you can see that I've used there, and then the second colour that I used to pick out some of the stones is leather brown, which is a brown that has a little bit of orange in it, I suppose. So that they're still natural colours and colours that stone would be, but just that it adds that little bit of variety compared to the aged bone colour, which is what I base coated with. And then just to finish it off, I put a wash over the top, which was a mix of my black and dark brown wash. That's just to, first of all, flow into all of the recesses to bring all of those joins out and the texture a little bit more. But also, it just helps to tie those colours together a little bit more, because without the wash, the bone white and the leather brown stones did look just a little bit off. But with those washes over the top, it just dulls them down a little bit, ties those three different colours together, but overall it gives a much more natural stone look than what I did with the church, because you do have that bit of variety from one stone to the next. And I think this is a big improvement over how I painted the stones with the church. So for all of the buildings from now on, whenever I'm painting stone, this is exactly how I'll be painting them. Alright, so similar to the way in which I ended up changing the way that I was painting the stone by picking out some in different colours to add a bit more natural variation, the exact same thing happened with the brickwork as well, because while I was really happy with the church, with the overall colouring that I got of the brickwork, it just looked too flat and uniform, whereas not every single brick is going to be the same colour. So you can see here, I've started off by painting all of these bricks in the exact same way as what I did with the church, so I base coated it with earth brown and then wet blended in some red and orange just to make it look a little bit more brickish overall. But now with that same orange and that same red, I'm picking out individual bricks, because in reality not every brick is the exact same colour. And then once I'd done that, I then just threw the same brown wash over the top, which is exactly how I finished off the bricks in the church. And again, like with my second go at painting the stone, this is a much more natural and realistic looking brickwork than what I did with the church, because there is more variation in it. Now here with the roof on this building, you can see that I'm obviously painting it a very different colour to the roofs on the other buildings. The main reason for that is because this building is from the Teutonic Knights expansion, which we haven't played the game yet, but I'm assuming this is going to be a different location to where the other buildings are, and so I thought this would just be a way to differentiate it a little bit just by painting the roof a different colour. But the way that I'm painting it is exactly the same. So just hit it with the blue, then the blue wash over the top to bring out all of the detail, and then now I'm going back to the base coat colour and gradually mixing in more and more grey just to lighten some of the tiles off, and then I will throw the same brown washes over the top. But the overall look that I'm going for here is more of a stone kind of roof rather than the type of slate that was used in the other ones, just to make it look as though this building was built somewhere else, which is what I'm assuming it will be in the game. But the colour choices that I went for here were picked mainly because in videos that I've watched of people painting buildings like taverns and things like that, that's kind of colouring that often gets used, and I've always thought it looks really cool, so that's why I went with it. No grander reason than that. Alright, so just as I start to finish off this thatch roof, that brings the very last building to an end. So thank you very, very much for checking out another one of my videos, and I really, really do hope you enjoyed watching it because I absolutely loved painting these videos. Like I said earlier, there is a lot of potential here for buildings and terrain to be my preferred thing to paint over characters and other types of miniatures, but I do need to paint a few more before I actually finally make that call. But I just absolutely loved the really kind of loose painting nature that there was to it. I didn't have to be nearly as precise as what I do with smaller characters, and it was just lots and lots of fun to be able to focus on building up lots of textures and getting heaps of tonal variety to try and accurately represent the way that these different materials look. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button to stay up to date with future videos as they keep coming out, as well as stopping by the Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts for this channel so that you can see what I'm painting and what videos are going to keep coming out. But that's going to do us for today, so until next time, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.